Do you ever wonder why those summer food preservation secrets just vanished? They kept fresh food lasting through heat, storms, and tight budgets. If no one teaches them now, what are we really losing? You could always tell who had a good strawberry harvest by the neat little jars lined up on their kitchen shelves, wax-sealed and sparkling in the summer light. Back then, paraffin wax was the go-to trick for sealing homemade strawberry preserves, especially before everyone had reliable refrigeration. You would heat the fruit with sugar until it bubbled, then pour it into jars and top it off with melted wax that hardened into a pale, cloudy lid. It was sticky work. Your fingers would always end up covered, but there was a sort of satisfaction in peeling back that wax a few months later and tasting real strawberry sunshine in January. The wax kept air out and freshness in, a simple barrier that worked if you did it right. Some folks swore by adding a thin layer of brandy underneath for extra safety, but most just trusted their wax and crossed their fingers. You would see these preserves come out at church picnics or as Christmas gifts, with a fabric square tied over the top and a little handwritten label. These jars were more than just food. They were proof you knew how to make summer last. And when your only freezer was a block of ice in a box, that was a talent worth holding on to. Green tomato relish was one of those pantry staples you never appreciated until it disappeared. It showed up late in the season when the tomato vines gave you fruit that had no chance of ripening. Instead of tossing them out, folks chopped them fine with onions, peppers, and vinegar, boiling everything down into a tangy, chunky spread that went great on beans, franks, or cold sandwiches. It had a bite to it, sharp but sweet, and it was a clever way to stretch the last of the garden without wasting a thing. In households that canned seriously, it was a whole day affair. Sinks full of green tomatoes, pots bubbling, and someone on jar duty. You would hear the lids pop as they sealed one by one, and it was music to any home cook's ears. This relish was so common during the war and Depression years that it ended up in almost every community cookbook, tucked between jellies and pickles like it belonged there, which it did. It was comfort food hidden in a mason jar, made not from abundance, but from knowing how to stretch what little you had. And the best part? It just kept getting better the longer it sat on the shelf, mellowing with time into something special. There was something oddly magical about apple rings drying on a clothesline, turning golden and leathery in the sun. In the days before food dehydrators or airtight plastic, families would string up fresh apple slices, sometimes dipped in lemon water, sometimes dusted in cinnamon, and hang them outside to dry naturally. The air was hot, the sun was strong, and the apples would shrink, curl, and darken just enough to concentrate all that natural sweetness. If you were lucky, bees and birds stayed away. If not, you had to watch them like a hawk. Most families just accepted a few losses. The finished rings were chewy, sweet, and tart all at once, almost candy-like but a lot more practical. Once dried, they were packed away in tins or paper bags and used in pies, oatmeal, or just eaten straight from the jar during winter. Kids would sneak them off the pantry shelf like snacks, and mothers would pretend not to notice. There was something nice about knowing your apples had made it through summer and were waiting for you in February. And there was a kind of quiet pride in doing it yourself by hand, the slow, careful way that did not need plastic or a plug. Most people today toss out the watermelon rind without a second thought, but back then it was considered wasteful to throw away something so usable. Pickled watermelon rind was a sweet and sour preserve made from the thick, pale green part just under the pink flesh. You peeled off the outer skin, cut it into cubes, and simmered it with sugar, vinegar, cloves, and sometimes a cinnamon stick. After that, it went into jars, sealed and stacked like any other pickle. The result was firm but tender, syrupy but tangy, and it paired surprisingly well with ham, beans, or even cold roast beef. It became especially popular during the Depression when every scrap of food needed a second purpose. Grandmothers would collect leftover rinds at church picnics, cut off any pink bits, and pickle them all in one go. In many homes, it was the only dessert-like item that came out of the cellar that was not canned peaches or applesauce, and it had a beautiful glow to it too, translucent and golden in the jar like stained glass. It might sound strange now, but anyone who grew up with pickled rinds on the table knows just how special they were. They turned scraps into something quietly beautiful, and no one teaches that anymore. Long before there were deep freezers or foil-wrapped zucchini at the grocery store, summer squash got tucked away underground. It was called root cellaring, and it was a tried-and-true way to keep your vegetables cool, dark, and dry without electricity. You would wrap each squash in newspaper, layer it in a wooden crate filled with sawdust or dry sand, and store the crate in a cellar or basement corner. Not every squash made it through the season, but most did, at least long enough to help stretch out meals until winter storage crops kicked in. These were not summer recipes, exactly. They were survival strategies. And in some homes, that little stash of squash meant the difference between a filling stew or just another potato dinner. You learned to rotate the crates, to check for mold, and to handle each squash like it was glass. There was care in the process, passed down like a family secret. Modern kitchens forgot this kind of patience. But if you ever had to get by without a fridge, you would suddenly understand why root cellaring mattered. It was not stylish. It was not new. But it worked. And that made it worth everything. Salt was not just a seasoning, it was a preservation tool, especially when it came to green beans. In the Appalachian Mountains and across the rural South, families would pack snapped green beans into ceramic crocks, layer them with salt, and press them down with a plate and a weight. The salt drew out moisture and kept bacteria at bay, turning crisp summer beans into something that could last for months in the cool dark. When it was time to use them, you would soak the beans in water to reduce the salt, then cook them low and slow with bacon grease or onion. The flavor was deep, earthy, and bold, nothing like fresh beans but comforting in its own way. Salted beans were a staple on winter tables, often served with cornbread or potatoes, especially when the garden had long stopped giving. Some people called them leather breeches, though that name usually meant air-dried beans strung on thread. Either way, the principle was the same: waste nothing and make summer last. And in places where grocery trips were rare and money even rarer, a salty crock of beans could be a lifeline. Sweet corn was summer's crown jewel, but if you wanted to enjoy it in January, you had to work for it. Canning corn at home was not for the faint of heart. It had to be pressure canned, not just water-bathed, or else you risked botulism, a word every homemaker knew even if they could not spell it. The kernels had to be cut fresh from the cob, packed into jars, covered with boiling water or corn milk, and processed under high heat for a long stretch of time. It was messy, sticky work that filled the kitchen with steam, but if you did it right, you ended up with shelves of golden kernels, ready for chowders, casseroles, or skillet fry-ups. In farm families, it was a point of pride to have dozens of jars stacked high before the first frost hit. And the taste? Nothing like canned corn from the store. It was buttery, sweet, and somehow still tasted like sunshine. Some folks added a pinch of sugar or salt, others swore by blanching first. But no matter the method, canned corn meant you had planned ahead. And that kind of foresight used to mean everything. If your lunchbox ever had something leathery and sweet tucked into wax paper, chances are it came from a tray of homemade apricot leather. This was long before fruit roll-ups showed up in grocery aisles, when fruit leather actually meant a labor of love from the kitchen. Ripe apricots were pureed, lightly sweetened, and sometimes blended with lemon juice, then spread thin on a lined tray and left to dry in the sun or a low oven. Over time, the puree turned dense, chewy, and just sticky enough to make you feel like a kid again. The trick was not letting it get too brittle. Good fruit leather should bend, not crack. Once dry, it was rolled up in wax paper and packed away for school lunches, road trips, or just late-night snacks. It kept for weeks without refrigeration and stayed tasting like summer long after the leaves had turned. Some families made it with peaches or plums too, depending on what the orchard gave them, but apricot was the classic, bright, tangy, and honest. The kind of snack that told you someone at home cared enough to make something from scratch. There was a time when the smell of sauerkraut in the basement was a good sign, not something to wrinkle your nose at. That sour, tangy aroma meant someone had been busy shredding cabbage, salting it, and packing it tight into a stoneware jug to ferment. Sauerkraut was not just a side dish, it was insurance. Cabbage was cheap, hardy, and easy to grow. But once summer ended, it did not keep long without help. So families across the Midwest and Northeast learned to preserve it with salt and thyme, letting natural bacteria do the rest. After a few weeks, the cabbage would soften, sour, and develop that unmistakable tang. You did not need vinegar or fancy jars, just patience and a cool place to store it. Come winter, sauerkraut got served with sausages, baked into casseroles, or even eaten cold with bread and mustard. It was rich in vitamin C, which made it especially important when fresh produce was scarce. And if you had a family recipe, odds are it came with stories too. Because sauerkraut was not just food, it was heritage, survival, and a little bit of science in a jug. Sun tea was summer in a jar, plain and simple. No stove, no kettle, no plugs, just a big glass jar, a few tea bags, and the heat of a long afternoon. You filled the jar with water, dropped in the tea, and set it in a sunny spot for hours, letting the warmth steep the leaves slowly and gently. By evening, the tea was deep amber, mellow, and ready to pour over ice. Some added lemon slices, others went for mint or sugar. But most just kept it simple. This was porch-sipping tea, made while you were out in the garden or shelling peas. It was not a luxury. It was just how things were done when energy was precious and fridges were small. You could store the tea in the icebox or a cool cellar, and it usually lasted a couple of days if you did not drink it all first. These days, you might see fancy glass dispensers and flavored syrups, but nothing tastes quite like the real thing. Tea made slow with nothing but sun and time. You could always spot a jar of pickled beets by its deep red glow, sitting proudly on a shelf beside the jams and jellies. These were not fancy store-bought slices. These were garden beets boiled until tender, then soaked in vinegar, sugar, and spice until they took on that perfect balance of sweet and tangy. People canned them in wide-mouthed jars, stacking them up for winter salads and holiday spreads. They would get sliced and tossed with onions, maybe chilled in a little juice, or laid out next to cold ham on Christmas. It was not about flavor alone. It was about preserving a crop that came and went in a blink. You only had so much time to pull beets from the dirt and get them into jars before the heat got to them. And once sealed, those jars could last for months. Even if you hated beets fresh, the pickled version usually won people over. It was one of those quiet recipes that stuck around in family cookbooks, passed down with notes like, "Add more sugar," or "Skip the cloves." A good jar of pickled beets told you someone in that house had been paying attention when it counted. Peach canning day was a sticky, sweet, all-hands-on-deck kind of affair. You started early, peeling skin off ripe peaches with quick fingers, your hands covered in juice before the second basket was touched. The fruit got packed into jars, layered gently, then covered in thick sugar syrup until it looked like sunshine sealed in glass. That syrup was not just for sweetness, it was preservation. With it, those peaches could sit on a shelf for months and still taste like July. Once sealed, the jars were flipped upside down to cool, their lids popping as they tightened. You always knew someone in the family who swore their jar count like a badge of honor. Come winter, those peaches went into cobblers, crisps, and cottage puddings. They showed up at Sunday suppers or got spooned straight from the jar into cereal bowls. There was comfort in knowing they were there, lined up on pantry shelves, waiting. Every golden jar reminded you of warm kitchens, wet counters, and the heavy scent of peach steam in the air. It was not just food, it was planning, patience, and love all sealed into one. In some kitchens, the smell of brine was just a part of summer. Dill cucumbers were cut by hand, long, crisp spears from backyard vines or farmers' markets, then packed into jars with garlic, spices, and plenty of fresh dill heads. In bigger households, they went into wooden or ceramic barrels first, to ferment slowly before being transferred into jars. That was the old way. The spears stayed submerged under brine with the help of a plate or rock, and you would wait for the tang to build before sealing. Everyone had their own method, but the process stayed the same across generations. Kids helped wash the cucumbers and shove them into jars, maybe even wrote out the labels in wobbly handwriting. Those jars filled the basement shelves, glowing green behind cloudy glass. They were pulled out all year long, especially when cold roast or sandwiches made it to the table. These pickles had bite, backbone, and a story. You could taste the summer sun and garden dirt in every crunch. And the brine? You did not throw that out. You used it again, or sipped it cold from the jar when you needed a little wake-up. Mustard pickles looked like sunshine in a jar, bright yellow, chunky, and sweet with a little vinegar bite. They were not just cucumbers. These pickles had cauliflower, pearl onions, and sometimes even green beans, all chopped small and simmered in a thick, mustard-based sauce. The mix was poured hot into jars, sealed, and set aside until winter sandwiches or baked meats needed something sharp to cut through the fat. You saw them at roadside farm stands, where glass jars caught the light and tempted every car that passed. Every batch was a little different depending on what vegetables were left over. Some folks made them thin and smooth like a relish. Others kept everything chunky. Either way, it was the kind of thing you kept in the fridge and pulled out every day. They gave old meatloaf new life, cold turkey a second chance. And with enough sugar and vinegar, even bitter cauliflower became something to look forward to. People used what they had, stretched what they could, and made something special out of scraps. That was mustard pickles in a nutshell, a thrifty jar of bold flavor that never let you down. Rhubarb never stayed around for long, which is why people moved fast to get it into jars. It was one of the earliest things ready in the garden, usually showing up before strawberries even had a chance. That tart red stalk had bite, sharp, sour, and strong, but cooked down with sugar, it softened into something that almost passed for fruit. You cleaned it, chopped it, and boiled it until tender, then packed it into jars with syrup or its own juice. If you were lucky, you got a dozen jars done before the rhubarb wilted. Come December, those jars came out like buried treasure. Spoonfuls got folded into pies, crisps, or spread over toast with a little butter. It was not sweet like peaches or plums, but it had its own charm, grown-up flavor, bold and bracing. It was a forgotten taste in a world that prefers easy sweetness now. But back then, rhubarb was a sign that summer had truly begun. And putting it away for later? That was a kind of quiet celebration, a way of saying, we will need this, come the cold. Tomato juice was a summer task that took over entire afternoons, especially if the harvest was big. You would haul in baskets of ripe tomatoes, wash them, slice them, and cook them down into a thick, pulpy sauce. Then you would run them through a sieve or food mill, catching seeds and skins on one side and smooth juice on the other. That juice got poured into glass bottles, often the ones that once held soda or beer, washed and reused until the labels faded away. You sealed them up, sometimes with wax, sometimes with metal caps, and let them cool. The finished bottles lined the cellar shelves like red soldiers in formation. That tomato juice went into everything: soups, stews, chili, or just sipped warm with a little salt. In some households, it was even used for medicinal purposes like fighting off colds or settling stomachs. It had a strong, earthy flavor, nothing like the stuff in cartons today. Every bottle tasted a little different, depending on which tomatoes ripened first and how long you let them cook. But one thing stayed true. This was not waste. This was how you saved summer in a bottle. Plum jam had a habit of staining your hands deep purple while you worked, but no one minded much. It started with backyard trees, branches heavy with fruit that bruised the moment you touched them. You would pick them by the bucket, rinse them in cold water, and pit them one by one at the kitchen table. Then came the slow cook, plums, sugar, and lemon zest bubbling away in a big pot until they broke down into something glossy and thick. The whole house smelled like candy. Some people added cinnamon or cloves, others left it plain, relying on the fruit's natural tartness to carry the flavor. When the jam reached the right consistency, It was spooned hot into jars and sealed, one careful ladle at a time. That jam was smeared on biscuits, stirred into yogurt, or used as cake filling during the holidays. Kids would sneak spoonfuls when no one was looking. It was rich and honest, just sweet enough without tipping over into syrup. And if you had a good tree, those jars kept the whole family happy for months. A simple jam, maybe, but always made with both hands and heart. Zucchini always seemed to show up faster than you could use it. It grew fast, got big, and before you knew it, you had more than the kitchen could handle. So you made relish. You grated the zucchini fine, salted it, squeezed out the water, and mixed it with chopped peppers, onions, vinegar, sugar, and spice. Then you cooked it down until it turned golden green and spooned it into hot jars. It was sweet, tangy, and just a little crunchy. Some people called it a sandwich spread. Others treated it more like a condiment. But every cold-cut sandwich that needed help came alive with a spoonful of this stuff. It showed up at church potlucks and alongside meatloaf. It helped stretch meals when there was not much meat to go around, and it was one more way to keep that mountain of zucchini from going to waste. If you had never tried zucchini relish, you probably grew up with just pickles on your sandwich. But those who did remember it always seem to smile when they talk about it. That is how you know it mattered. 3-day pickles were the answer for folks who wanted something sharp and crunchy without firing up the canner. You started with fresh cucumbers, small, firm, and thin-skinned, then sliced them into spears or rounds. You boiled up a simple brine of vinegar, sugar, salt, and spices, poured it over the cucumbers in a big bowl or jar, and tucked the whole thing in the fridge. Then you waited. Day 1, they still tasted raw. Day 2, they started to mellow. By day 3, the magic happened. They snapped just right, with a tangy sweetness that lingered. No sealing, no boiling water baths, no special tools. Just patience and a cool place to let things happen. These pickles were easy, reliable, and quick enough to keep up with a fast-moving summer. They lived in old mayonnaise jars or crocks, not fancy canning sets. You pulled them out for sandwiches, cookouts, or snacks. And the best part? You could make another batch the minute you ran out. It was preservation made simple. Quiet, unpretentious, and exactly what the kitchen needed. Under the porch, in the cool shadows between the wooden beams, that is where the root baskets lived. Wire or wicker, lined with burlap or old towels, they held the last survivors of summer: onions, potatoes, carrots, each one packed in dry layers of sand or sawdust to keep the moisture out. This was cold storage, plain and simple. No electricity, no hum of a freezer, just the Earth's own air conditioning doing the work. You would reach down there in midwinter and come up with vegetables that were still firm, still good, not perfect, not pretty, but ready to eat. If something spoiled, you cut off the bad and use the rest. You learned how to rotate them, how to spot soft spots early, how to stack them so nothing crushed. Kids were sent down with a lantern and a basket, told to fetch dinner right off the dirt floor. And when groceries were tight, that little stash under the porch meant dinner still happened. You would be surprised how long a well-kept potato could hang on. It was food security sitting in the shadows, quietly waiting to be needed. Peach pit jelly was the kind of thing your grandmother made without even thinking twice. She had already canned her peaches, peeled them, sliced them, packed them in syrup, but instead of tossing the pits and skins, she turned them into jelly. You boiled the scraps down with water, strained out the solids, and simmered the liquid again with sugar and pectin until it turned into a golden amber jelly that looked like sunshine in a jar. It had a soft floral flavor, lighter than peach preserves and sweet in a way that felt old-fashioned. You spread it on toast or stirred it into oatmeal. Some even used it to glaze meats. But more than anything, it was about refusing to waste what still had flavor left. Back then, frugality was not just smart, it was expected. Even the peel had a job. Even the pit had one more thing to give. And somewhere between boiling and bottling, that pile of scraps became a little jar of treasure. These days, most people would not think to save the leftovers, let alone make jelly from them. But that is the kind of wisdom we should have held on to. tomato aspic was one of those recipes that confused most kids but never failed to show up at church potlucks. It started with tomato juice, homemade if you had it, store-bought if you did not, mixed with unflavored gelatin and spiced with vinegar, Worcestershire sauce, and celery salt. The mixture was poured into molds, chilled until firm, and served cold, often with a scoop of cottage cheese or a sprig of parsley on the side. To some, it was a delicacy. To others, a mystery. But it had its place on mid-century American tables, clipped from Good Housekeeping or typed up on an index card. The tangy, savory wobble sat proud among casseroles and Jell-O molds, bringing a strange kind of elegance to hot weather meals. Tomato aspic was not about luxury, it was about using what you had and presenting it in a way that felt formal. In summer kitchens without air conditioning, serving something cool and set made perfect sense. Even if no one makes it now, the memory of that glassy red ring still sticks with anyone who ever scooped it from a Pyrex bowl. Some dishes fade, others jiggle their way into history. Back before every kitchen had neat rows of mason jars, folks made do with what they had, including old coffee tins. Bread and butter pickles were sweet, tangy cucumber slices made with onions, vinegar, and sugar, perfect for sandwiches or fried chicken sides. After boiling the mixture, they would be packed into whatever container was available, often wide coffee tins rinsed clean and ready to serve a second life. The pickles soaked up the brine and kept in the icebox, their flavor deepening with time. These were not long storage pickles meant for years on a shelf. They were fridge pickles, made for quick lunches and warm evenings. You would grab a forkful and lay them on white bread with cold cuts or eat them straight out of the tin. It was the kind of kitchen trick that happened without ceremony. Just a batch whipped up in the middle of canning day. A quiet reward for the work. You did not need fancy equipment or matching lids. You just needed a good recipe, a clean tin, and a bit of vinegar bite. That was enough, more than enough. Backyard grapevines were once more than decoration. They were a pantry in disguise. When late summer rolled around, the clusters got heavy, deep purple, and bursting with juice. Instead of making wine, a lot of families boiled the grapes down and strained the juice to make concentrate. It was sweet, tart, and packed with flavor. You funneled the liquid into old baby food jars or recycled medicine bottles, whatever glass you had, sealed them up, and tucked them into cool shelves to mix with well water later. The result was grape juice that tasted bold and real, nothing like what came from a carton. A spoonful or two stirred into a cold glass gave you a drink worth savoring, especially when store-bought soda was out of reach. This was kids' juice, yes, but also something more. It was summer saved in tiny jars, a little indulgence that took time to make but lasted for months, and it felt like magic. One jar, one splash, and you had a glass full of sun. Apple butter was not made in a hurry. You peeled and sliced the apples first, bushels of them, then cooked them down slow in a heavy cast iron pot with cider, sugar, and warm spices. The mixture darkened as it thickened, deep brown and velvety, and it needed constant stirring to keep from burning. Someone always had to mind the pot. It bubbled all day long until it reached just the right consistency, thick enough to hold its shape on a spoon. When it was ready, it got ladled into jars and sealed tight. In winter, it was spread on cornbread or biscuits, or stirred into oatmeal for a rich, spiced kick. Some folks treated it like jam. Others swore it belonged on pork chops. Either way, it was a quiet kitchen triumph, humble but full of care. You could taste the time in every bite. These days, most people would not stand over a pot for hours to make something that costs a couple dollars at the store. But that was never the point. It was about making the most of what the orchard gave you and not letting any of it go to waste. Freezer slaw was one of those little miracles that only seemed to come from handwritten recipe cards. It was a vinegar-based cabbage slaw, no mayo, no cream, made to hold up in the cold without turning soggy. You chopped cabbage, carrots, and maybe green peppers, salted them down, and pressed out the extra moisture. Then you poured over a hot dressing of sugar, vinegar, and celery seed, let it cool, and froze it in batches. Pulled from the deep freeze, it thawed bright, crisp, and just sweet enough. You would never guess it had been frozen at all. It showed up at barbecues, weeknight dinners, and last-minute lunches, always ready to go. In homes where fresh salad was a luxury and lettuce wilted too fast, freezer slaw was a steady solution. It stretched the garden harvest into winter and brought crunch to plates that needed something sharp. These days, it is almost completely forgotten. But for those who remember it, it was genius, simple, sturdy, and always there when you needed it. Wild berry syrup was not something you bought. It started with scratched hands, berry buckets, and bramble bushes. You picked blackberries, raspberries, or elderberries until your fingers were stained and your feet ached. Then you took them home, boiled them with sugar and a little water, and strained out the seeds. What was left was a deep, jewel-colored syrup poured into old wine bottles, whiskey jugs, or whatever tall glass container you had cleaned and saved. Once cooled, it went into the pantry, ready for pancakes, waffles, or stirred into lemonade. It was rich, bold, and just a little tart. Some people added lemon zest or clove. Others kept it plain, letting the berries speak for themselves. You did not need much. A drizzle went a long way. And because it was shelf-stable, it lasted until well after the frost came. This was not just syrup. It was memory in a bottle. A season's work, boiled down and sweetened, waiting on the shelf for when you needed to remember what summer tasted like. Egg preservation was once common knowledge. Now it barely gets a mention. Before electric fridges were everywhere, families preserved eggs in a lime solution called water glass. Clean, unwashed eggs were gently lowered into crocks or stone jugs filled with the mixture, sealed up, and stored in cool pantries or cellars. Done right, the eggs stayed good for months, sometimes even into spring. No cracking, no smell, just fresh eggs ready to cook when hens stopped laying in the cold. It was a quiet miracle of chemistry, one that allowed bakers to keep going and breakfasts to stay familiar. People planned their egg usage around it. They knew which crocks were oldest, which batches to use first. It took patience, care, and trust in the process. Today, most people have never even heard of it. But back then, it was as normal as buttering toast. One more way they made the most of what they had, and refused to be caught unprepared. Spaghetti sauce used to mean a Sunday simmer pot, not a jar from the store. Tomatoes came from the backyard or the local stand, picked at their peak. You would peel, seed, and cook them down with onions, garlic, herbs, and a little sugar to cut the bite. The pot bubbled low for hours, filling the house with the smell of something worth waiting for. Families added their own touches: basil from the garden, a pinch of red pepper, or dried oregano crushed between their fingers. Once thick enough, the sauce got poured into jars and sealed, still hot, ready to be shelved for the colder months. This was not fast food. It was food with memory. It went into lasagna, stuffed shells, or just poured over boiled pasta with a bit of cheese on top. No preservatives, no shortcuts, just a big pot, a wooden spoon, and time. It was summer in a jar, built from scratch. And for Italian-American families especially, it was tradition. Not written down, but known by heart. Okra was never everyone's favorite, but if you grew it, you learned how to keep it. The trick was pickling it, whole and fresh, before the pods got tough. You packed them standing tall in crocks or jars with vinegar, garlic, mustard seeds, and a chili or two for heat. Over time, they soaked in all that flavor and turned tart, crunchy, and just the right kind of slippery. Southern kitchens knew this well. Pickled okra showed up with cold cuts, beans, or even tucked onto deviled egg platters. It kept well without refrigeration and added something sharp to otherwise heavy meals. It was a food of resourcefulness, grown at home, preserved with care, and used all year long. You did not need fancy spices or tight lids, just a cool corner, a clean jar, and a habit passed down from someone older. Most folks today have never tasted real pickled okra, but if you ever have, you remember it. It stays with you. So, putting your fruits in sugar to preserve them is an age-old trick that's been around forever. Are you interested in the know-how, though? because it's actually a lot of neat little stuff working together to make sure you can get 1 or 2 days more out of that banana. So, first, we need to talk about a little something called osmotic pressure. Sugar tends to make an environment with a high amount of osmotic pressure, and this really draws water out of microbial cells, which includes things like bacteria and yeast. Microbes basically need their daily 8 glasses of water to live, or they'll die, and unlike us, they can't substitute that for a Coke and a cigarette. Sugar binds with molecules in water, and it robs those microorganisms of what they need to live. Pretty brutal, right? That's not sweet at all. I bet you didn't know how much sugar reduces it either, and your overall water activity actually goes below 0.85 plus. It also works as an antioxidant. What does that mean? Basically, the enzymes that are responsible for browning your fruit, ruining that perfectly ripe taste, sugar gets rid of that. All in all, it's your go-to solution for making your fruits last longer, look better, and taste fresher also. Just be cleaner overall. Really just a pit stop for your fruit basket. Rennet preservation, on the other hand, is a whole different animal. Rennet is an enzyme that's traditionally made from ruminant animals like cows, goats, and sheep. It helps to make cheese because it coagulates milk and causes the proteins in it to curdle and separate. This transformation is pretty much the sole reason why fresh milk even becomes cheese, and I'm going to explain to you how all this works. So, when you mix rennet with milk, it has the enzyme renin in it. This specifically hits the primary protein in milk, which is casein. Imagine if somebody basically made really specific cuts in your limbs, causing the rest of your body to clump together. Maybe not the most descriptive example, but that's pretty much what happens. What you get left with is whey, and that's drained off. The leftover curds are then processed into different types of cheese. See, people didn't do this because they really love cheese, though. They did it because it was the ideal way to use your milk. Milk would spoil incredibly fast, and for people who were either living a very day-to-day life, taking it as it comes, that just wasn't fitting in with their routines or priorities. Cooking with canning jars is one of the most common things to do because they're built to do really well around high temperatures. People use it during sous vide, or to bake, or even when they're slow cooking. These jars are airtight, and their heat resistance really isn't a joke. You should look up how good tempered glass is when it comes to dealing with extreme heat, because it's literally the entire point of picking it out for the canning jars. The jars are usually heated to really high temperatures so that the food inside can be sterilized and preserved, and the glass actually expands and then contracts back to its original size and shape without breaking. This means you can place it on any source of heat, a stove, an oven, or even a pot of boiling hot water, and not worry about any glass exploding in your kitchen. If you cook with canning jars, then the context of slow cooking really is the best one to use them in. The airtight seal really helps to trap moisture in, which helps to boost the flavor of something by several levels. You also get some pretty even cooking since what you're cooking in doesn't have a lot of space, though that comes with some side effects like managing your portion or needing to cook a few more times than normal. Still, I bet you didn't know we could cook with canning jars, did you? The typical scrambled eggs breakfast has been more or less a national tradition for so many years, it is impossible to tell where it really started. Low-key, small-time diners, high-tier French-American restaurants, and steakhouses all serve some kind of variation on eggs, including scrambled-ons. Hence, what do you do to add a little bit of variety, texture, and a bit of spaz to this classical option? If mayonnaise can work wonders for a burger, why not try it here? No, seriously, you'd be surprised. We know most people never make the link between eggs and mayo, but they can actually make them so much more fluffier and add this nice creamy texture too. If you do not believe us, then just search up any grandma's recipe for mayo eggs. Do not knock it till you try it. When life gives you choke cherries, a fruit so tart it makes lemons look sweet, you don't eat them raw. Instead, you turn them into something extraordinary, like choke cherry syrup. For indigenous peoples and early settlers, it was a clever way to preserve the fruit and make use of a wild harvest. Choke cherries, native to North America, were boiled down with water and sometimes sweetened with honey or sugar to create a thick, tangy syrup. This process concentrated the flavor and ensured the fruit could last far beyond its brief season. The syrup could then be stored in jars or crocks, providing a burst of flavor during the colder months when fresh fruit was scarce. Nutritionally, choke cherries were small but mighty. Packed with antioxidants and vitamins, they offered a health boost that paired nicely with their versatility. The syrup could be drizzled on bread, mixed into porridge, or even used as a glaze for meat. Culturally, choke cherries held deep importance for many indigenous tribes. They were also used as medicine. The bark and seeds were used in remedies, and the fruit itself was seen as a gift from the land. The name choke cherry comes from the fruit's astringency, which can literally make your throat tighten if eaten raw. Thankfully, with a little ingenuity and a lot of syrup, they became one of the sweetest survival foods in history. Now, the next thing we have is packing your meat in saltwater brine. The reason this works is because saltwater brine is a method of preserving food by submerging it in a mix of salt, water, and ingredients like herbs and spices for aromatics. Salt pretty much gets rid of any kind of moisture that you don't need and makes an environment that promotes longevity in your protein by getting rid of any bacteria that would cause spoilage. The concentration of salt is around 10%, and when dissolved in water, you basically get a bath with some really nice preserving effects. Curing ingredients, like the ones used in cold smoking meats, are often things like sugar, nitrates, or spices that people would add to the brine. This would help add flavor and make sure the meat keeps its color, just like how we discussed before when nitrates came up. Brining would typically take a while, but that would depend on the kind of meat you were using and its size. It wasn't really just people who were living centuries ago that did this. Lots of indigenous communities, nomadic people, and even upscale restaurants still use brining as a technique to either preserve meat or to increase its lifespan. Brining helps to bring flavors out because the meat stays submerged for so long, the flavors get infused. The next time you want to figure out how to take your meat up a notch, maybe try a saltwater brine. You've heard this one 1,000 times before, and for good reason too. People dry their herbs because it's simply one of the best, oldest, and most effective ways of removing any excess moisture, keeping all that icky, bacterial nonsense off of your herbs, and making sure that your greens last as long as you need them to. You're here for the why, though, and that's what I'm here to answer for you. When you dry herbs, you reduce their overall water content. As we've discussed already, a bunch of harmful bacteria and microorganisms desperately need water and air to survive, and in that regard, they're really not so different from us. Volatile oils, on the other hand, are what give herbs and aromatics their flavor and scents. This is why you've probably heard folk tips, such as boiling herbs to clear out odors. High temperatures cause these essentials to leak out, so the opposite, which in this case is proper drying, actually helps maintain these oils in the herbs, sealing all that flavor and fragrance in. In Native American traditions, their herbalists used to dry herbs to ensure that treatments, ointments, medicinal balms, and herb-based remedies were available to the community all year round. Yarrow and chamomile, for example, were and still are big-time staples of household remedies. During World War II, these practices were adopted by the mainstream to help victory gardens provide more produce that would last longer as well. So, it might be a basic trick, but it's got a lot of benefits and history behind it. So this one might really be a wonder for you, but it actually does work, both in theory and execution. Using bread to revive hardened sugar is a classic kitchen hack that basically just plays around a little bit with science to get some much-needed utility in the kitchen. So, people weren't just using sugar, they had substituted it with brown sugar, and that really was prone to hardening a lot. It wasn't good at keeping its moisture, especially since brown sugar had a decent amount of molasses. Those had water content, but it would pretty much evaporate and cause the bits of sugar to lump together. Now, the issue here seems to be that we don't have enough water to keep things going around here, right? Bread, conveniently enough, has an incredible amount of water content. The moisture in bread is around 35 to 45%, and when you put that up against hardened sugar, the difference comparatively is immense. The process by which you take advantage of all this is called diffusion. It helps water molecules move from a densely packed surface like the bread to a place that's missing water. Think of it like a revive in a Call of Duty game. Once you put that bread in an airtight container with the sugar, the vapor the bread gives off naturally starts diffusing into the sugar, and that in turn softens. Pretty neat, right? Just like breadcrumbs have become synonymous with providing the perfect golden, crunchy exterior, crushed cornflakes have the same reputation from our grandparents' days. Most things you would add this to, like chicken fillets or strips, would get significantly more crunchier and crispier, and the coating did not taste as much like cereal as you are thinking it would. It actually just tasted like pretty good skin, the kind that crumbles and falls apart in your mouth as you bite into it. Probably the biggest benefit of your grandma cooking things up this way was that it really cut down on the grease factor. That can leave even the most loyal, crispy chicken lover feeling bloated, oily, and a little turned off for the day. If you think acorns are just for squirrels, think again. For indigenous peoples across North America, acorns were a dietary cornerstone, transformed into a versatile ingredient, acorn flour. But before they could be eaten, these little nuts needed some serious prep work. Acorns are packed with tannins, bitter compounds that can upset your stomach. To make them edible, they were shelled, ground into a coarse meal, and repeatedly soaked in water to leach out the tannins. Once dried, the resulting flour could be stored for months, sometimes even years, if kept cool and dry. It was the ultimate, long-lasting pantry item. Nutritionally, acorn flour was a powerhouse. Rich in carbohydrates and fats, it provided slow-burning energy, perfect for people with physically demanding lifestyles. It could be made into porridge, bread, or even dumplings, offering a hearty meal that didn't rely on fragile crops like wheat. Culturally, acorns held deep significance. Oak trees were considered gifts of the land, and acorn processing was often a communal activity. Some indigenous groups even used specific tools, like rock mortars carved into bedrock, to grind the nuts. Certain oak species produced sweeter acorns, making them more prized. Imagine being the lucky one with the dessert oak in your backyard. Before the days of freezers and two-door fridges, we had cold cellars, which you may also have heard being referred to as root cellars. For centuries, this was pretty much the cornerstone of not just America, but global society as a whole on how to preserve their food. Why was that, though? Most modern freezers actually try to replicate the environments people had in cold cellars. The temperatures you'd find in these frosty rooms would go down to 30 degrees and 50 degrees, and that meant that enzymatic activity, the same thing we just discussed that browns your bananas bad, goes down heavily in vegetables and fruits. Cold temperatures basically do the same for microbes too. Stunted growth is bad for anyone, not just kids that don't drink their milk. Plus, cold cellars have really high levels of humidity. Moisture retention is a big deal for these things, you know. You don't give them enough of that, they're liable to die way before they need to. Yet you've also heard that too much of the stuff is bad for you. You've probably heard your parents say not to keep your apples too close or around too much air, or keep your onions separate. Well, that's because of ethylene gas. With too much moisture and not enough ventilation, the buildup of this gas and the release of it causes a lot of nasty cross-contamination. Basically, you don't want your fruits being bad neighbors, and cold cellars were such a nice neighborhood too. So no one's a stranger to the process of larding, but I think a lot of us just follow these things because they're generational, tried and tested tips and tricks we know work. Why do they work though? Well, if you've ever played FIFA or a Dragon Age game, then you know the concept of a defender or a tank. Lard kind of acts like that. It makes a protective barrier of fat, which melts away when you cook. But when you just coat it, it seals it from any outside exposure. This helps oxidation basically never happen, which means you don't get any nasty-smelling meat or spoilage. Meat needs to be juicy too, though. Fat helps keep a lot of that water and moisture in, because who likes their steak dry? Plus, did you know some organisms that spoil your stuff actually really just get off of air? Lard really helps choke them out. When we were living in colonial times and people were still immigrating to the South and West, larded meats were even a sign of luxury and were a big part of our culture. It was impossible to make those long treks without a supply of properly preserved and fresh meat. So, you really want that aesthetically perfect slice of cake, right? The one that looks like it's right out of a TV ad? The one that just looks wonderfully symmetrical and like it was cut by a pro? You can't get that with a knife, despite what the TV shows. We've all been there, friend. I'll let you in on a little secret too. They probably don't use knives either. When you start with a knife, especially if the blade is dull or blunt, then the pressure that the knife gives off might cause some pretty uneven compression throughout the cake. This can happen because of the knife or just you using too much force, but whatever the cause, you get uneven slices as a result. However, you don't get this problem with a string line. Know why? String lines create uniform pressure across the entire surface of the cake. You can pull the cake through the cake without much force either, unlike a knife, where you'd kind of have to try to push down. These two factors make string lines almost irreplaceable when it comes to slicing cake, because it means you get the most even slice with the least amount of force. Also, have you ever noticed the way cake sticks to knives? Strings don't really have that problem because of their thinness. Knives, on the other hand, are prone to dragging a lot of the cake with them. This is probably no surprise to a lot of people who grew up having mac and cheese at their grandma's house or from a street cart down the block. Just a little bit of mustard in your mac and cheese can do wonders for taking an already perfect dish and kicking it up several notches, but the question is, why? What does mustard do to mac and cheese that makes this pairing so irresistible that every vendor, grandma, and home chef from the Midwest to the northern areas tries it? It is because the acidity of the mustard really helps cut through all the fat in the macaroni and cheese and blends together with the flavor already there. You can find this in just about any grocery store too if you check the back of the box. Classic Dijon or yellow mustard adds that tang that makes your mac and cheese shine and stand out. When survival depended on what you could carry, one food stood out as the ultimate road snack: dried meat. Indigenous peoples of North America perfected the art of making jerky long before it became a gas station staple. Using techniques that were as practical as they were ingenious, they ensured meat could last for weeks or even months without spoiling. The preservation method was simple but effective. Thin strips of meat, often bison, deer, or elk, were cut and dried in the sun or smoked over a fire. The low moisture and high protein content made it lightweight, portable, and perfect for long journeys. Early settlers and traders quickly adopted the practice, turning jerky into a frontier favorite. Jerky's cultural roots run deep, especially among Native American communities, where it was a way to maximize resources. Every part of the animal was used, embodying a respect for nature that modern sustainability movements could learn from. With its dense nutrition and near indestructibility, jerky became a food that could outlast even the toughest trails. It wasn't gourmet, but when you're miles from civilization, chewy beats hungry every time. So no one's a stranger to the process of larding, but I think a lot of us just follow these things because they're generational, tried and tested tips and tricks we know work. Why do they work, though? Well, if you've ever played FIFA or a Dragon Age game, then you know the concept of a defender or a tank. Lard kind of acts like that. It makes a protective barrier of fat, which melts away when you cook. But when you just coat it, it seals it from any outside exposure. This helps oxidation basically never happen, which means you don't get any nasty-smelling meat or spoilage. Meat needs to be juicy too, though. Fat helps keep a lot of that water and moisture in, because who likes their steak dry? Plus, did you know some organisms that spoil your stuff actually really just get off of air? Lard really helps choke them out. When we were living in colonial times and people were still immigrating to the South and West, larded meats were even a sign of luxury and were a big part of our culture. It was impossible to make those long treks without a supply of properly preserved and fresh meat. Curing with nitrates has been another way of preserving meat. They did 3 things, and they did them really well. Those were preserving your meat's color, killing off any bacteria, and enhancing flavor. Pretty good all-rounder, right? Turns out, we used to deal with a pretty nasty illness known as botulism, which happened thanks to the rampant growth of Clostridium botulinum in meat. Lots to pronounce, but the gist of it is that this foodborne illness goes bye-bye when you cure meat with nitrates. Myoglobin in meat reacts with nitrates to overall just wipe out scores of bacteria. It's a real bloodbath if you look at it through a microscope, really. What's up with the color thing, though? Nitrates can actually help keep your ham, bacon, or whatever it is looking really vibrant and fresh, and that's all because it's a damn good curing agent. Oxidation is a real pain, and it can happen to you or any food you love. Nitrates have become so common now that we actually can't tell they enhance flavor anymore, but they do. Try having meat with none of that stuff put in. You'll immediately be able to tell the difference. It's because nitrites break nitric oxide down and form flavor compounds with amino acids in meat. This basically is what enhances its umami flavor and is something that industries keep trying to do to push certain flavor profiles forward. They're after you. So, storing lettuce in damp cloths follows pretty much the exact same principles we went over while we were discussing how bread can help you get your sugar back. It's all about moisture retention, but this time around it's also got a lot to do with regulating the temperature of the lettuce. This really helps maintain the vegetable, because lettuce usually contains a lot of water, and that makes it easily perishable. Bummer, right? Especially when we use it in so many things, which always prompts you to buy in bulk. But that may not be the right idea, since you end up with wilted and dried lettuce, and no one wants that, right? Putting a damp cloth on it helps keep it humid, which means that the lettuce gets a perpetual source of moisture. This helps to keep the moisture in for long, and the cloth itself helps to absorb moisture coming in from the air and helps buffer the temperature too. You get a consistent humidity this way and some airflow since it is a cloth. All of this works really well by giving lettuce essentially the perfect environment it needs to last longer. This is one you have definitely heard about. Popeyes, Wendy's, KFC, or Burger King, there is nothing that hits that sweet spot in every corner of your head like some fried chicken does. Something about it makes it the perfect marriage between seasonings, oil, chicken, and breadcrumbs. You have probably tried this yourself too, but using baking powder on that chicken skin can get you some extra crispy zingers ready to go. Perfect for sandwiches, burgers, or just some chicken katsu curry. Ever feel like doing something extra with your chicken fillet? You know what to pull out of the cabinets. There's never been anything bad that came out of too much crispiness, except cholesterol issues and heart problems, but that's for like when you are 60 or something. For centuries, if you wanted meat that wouldn't spoil, salt was your best friend. Long before refrigeration, people preserved pork by packing it in salt, a method so effective that salted meat became a cornerstone of diets for sailors, pioneers, and soldiers alike. The process was as simple as it was transformative. Fresh cuts of pork were heavily salted and sometimes smoked. This drew out moisture, creating an inhospitable environment for bacteria. The result was meat that could survive a transatlantic journey or a winter on the frontier. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. Salt pork, with its high-fat content, provided essential calories and was a key ingredient in hearty dishes like stews and baked beans. Country ham, on the other hand, became a southern delicacy. Aged for months or even years, its bold, salty flavor was so intense that just a thin slice could elevate a meal. Country hams were sometimes aged in attics, where changing temperatures actually enhanced their flavor. Talk about climate control, 19th century style. Whether it was fueling pioneers or gracing holiday tables, salted meat proved that a little salt could go a long way, sometimes across entire continents. Curing with nitrates has been another way of preserving meat. They did 3 things, and they did them really well. Those were preserving your meat's color, killing off any bacteria, and enhancing flavor. Pretty good all-rounder, right? Turns out, we used to deal with a pretty nasty illness known as botulism, which happened thanks to the rampant growth of Clostridium botulinum in meat. Lots to pronounce, but the gist of it is that this foodborne illness goes bye-bye when you cure meat with nitrates. Myoglobin in meat reacts with nitrates to overall just wipe out scores of bacteria. It's a real bloodbath if you look at it through a microscope, really. What's up with the color thing, though? Nitrates can actually help keep your ham, bacon, or whatever it is looking really vibrant and fresh, and that's all because it's a damn good curing agent. Oxidation is a real pain, and it can happen to you or any food you love. Nitrates have become so common now that we actually can't tell they enhance flavor anymore, but they do. Try having meat with none of that stuff put in. You'll immediately be able to tell the difference. It's because nitrites break nitric oxide down and form flavor compounds with amino acids in meat. This basically is what enhances its umami flavor and is something that industries keep trying to do to push certain flavor profiles forward. They're after you. Just buying and using olive oil isn't enough. You need to also seal it properly, which can help the olive oil maintain its overall flavor. Why do you need to do this? Well, again, oxidation. Get used to it, man. We're going to be hearing a lot of it. It basically ruins the vibe of your olive oil completely because it destroys the compounds that give the oil its flavor, aroma, and health benefits, and basically means you waste your money. The fatty acids you have in your olive oil do not click well with oxygen at all. So the next question is, how do you store your olive oil properly? Now, the best thing to do is just to use an airtight container that doesn't let any kind of oxygen in. You want to ideally be using tight-fitting lids or glass bottles with tight caps. Tin over plastic is also pretty okay. You'd want to store the olive oil in a tin container though. The best thing is actually to get a dark container because this is the lesser-known fact about olive oil. Light, well, more so, the UV rays in light actually help to degrade olive oil by making oxidation a lot easier. You want to ideally store your olive oil in containers with dark colors that can limit the amount of light exposure it gets. Have you ever noticed how people have dark green jars and usually store their olive oil in small quantities? Yeah, now you know why? Share your family's forgotten food tricks below. Tap like if any stirred a memory, and hit subscribe to keep the old ways alive.